So the next section that we're going to talk about is evolution and the classification of life. So one of the things we want to talk about is the theory of evolution. The theory of evolution is going to be a core concept of biology. It explains both the diversity and the unity of life. Why there is so much diversity, why everything is so completely, like we're gonna talk about some of the huge range and diversity of life. But there are also some things like those main characteristics of life. We're also going to find when we start talking about basic chemistry that almost all living things are made up of only 6 different elements. There's a huge amount of unity in all different forms of life. So the idea of evolution is that it suggests how all living things are descended from a single common ancestor with modification to various environments over time. So the theory of evolution suggests how all living things descend from a common ancestor. Common descent with modification is the idea that descent occurs from common ancestors that had developed adaptations to suit their particular environments and needs. This is going to be most commonly known as the process of natural selection. So natural selection is the evolutionary mechanism that was proposed by Charles Darwin. So the idea is that some aspect of the environment selects which traits are going to be more apt to be passed on to the next generation. This selective agent could be an abiotic agent, so a physical trait of the environment, things like climate. Maybe it's really, really cold in the Arctic, so the bunnies who have thicker coats or a thicker fur are more likely to survive in that colder environment. So we're going to see after several generations, only bunnies who have really, really thick coats of fur and a thick layer of fat underneath that fur. Or there could be a biotic agent. It could possibly be predation that is going to be the environmental selective factor. Individuals who have favorable traits are going to produce the greater number of offspring that are going to survive and reproduce and pass those traits on to the next generation. And all individuals within a population have the potential to reproduce, but some organisms are going to be better at it than others. So like we said, it's a common characteristic of all living things have the ability to reproduce. Some organisms are better at reproducing. Now that could be maybe they have an easier time finding a mate. It could be that their offspring just have better chances of survival. It could be that they are physically stronger, more able to access food and nutrients, and thus have a better chance of just living longer and having more offspring. So some are going to be more successful at reproduction than others, and this is going to increase the frequency of those favorable traits in a population. So that's a whole lot of words. We're going to talk about this particular example. And what we see here we have a population of trees in the forest. All of the trees produce, all the trees in the forest, most of which are going to produce smooth leaves. Some tree, let's just say maybe 1 out of every, 8, produces hairy leaves. So this is just sort of a freak of nature. In this case, we had a genetic mutation. One tree starts producing a bunch of fuzzy leaves. Now here's the interesting thing. If there is deer in that forest, if the deer happen to favor the smooth leaves because they don't really like the taste of that hairy tree, we're going to find that the trees that have smooth leaves are going to be all stripped away by the deer who favor eating those leaves. But the tree, the one sort of genetic mutation that has these hairy leaves, he's going to have a better chance of surviving. He's going to have a better chance of reproducing. He's going to have a better chance of passing those hairy leaves onto the next generation because he has no predators. He's got no natural enemies. So what we're going to see is that if the deer in general favor all of the smooth leaves, we're going to find that after a few years, the plants with the hairy leaves are going to reproduce more than the other plants in the population. We might see over time there's actually going to be a change in the population where now after, a couple of decades, we see that the trees are about 50-50. Half are going to have hairy leaves, half are going to have smooth leaves. If that preference continues, if those deer stay in the area and continue to select for the smooth leaves, we might find that several generations later, almost all the trees in the forest have this hairy leaf adaptation because they're able to survive. They're able to thrive in this environment where the smooth leaves are going to be targeted by predators. So adaptations are always going to come from mutations. This is what introduces variations among members of a population. Classification is also going to be found under this heading. The evolutionary tree is going to be a visual tool that helps us trace ancestry of life on Earth back to a single ancestor. Evolution is going to be considered that unifying concept of biology because it explains so many aspects of how living things arose from a single ancestor. So because of the incredible diversity of life, it's going to be very useful for us to group organisms into categories. This category structure is what we call taxonomy. Taxonomy is going to be the discipline of biology that deals with identifying, naming, and classifying organisms according to certain rules. A lot of these rules are going to be based on either structure or behavior of the organisms. Systematics is going to be the study of evolutionary relationships between organisms, and we're going to talk a little bit about both of these. So the classification categories from least inclusive category, so species, to the most, or least inclusive category, species, to the most inclusive category, is going to be, well here, let's look at this next page. These are going to be the different levels of classification. Now you may have heard that humans are known as Homo sapiens. This means that we fall into the category of Homo and the species sapien. So I just want to walk through sort of our classification. Our domain that we belong to is going to be the domain Eukarya. Now, we are found in this domain because we have eukaryotic cells, meaning that our cells are made out of, or have membrane-bound organelles. The kingdom that we belong to is Animalia. Kingdom has to do with your digestive, your energy preferences. So if you are a plant, because you photosynthesize, you're going to be found in the kingdom Plantae. If you ingest your food, you're going to be found in the kingdom Animalia. Next, we have phylum. So not all animals are going to be found in this phylum. The next phylum is going to categorize animals based on whether or not they have a spinal cord. If you have a spinal cord, you're going to be found in the phylum Chordata. So it's kind of like how all squares are rectangles, but not all rectangles are squares. Every organism found in the phylum Chordata is going to be an animal, is going to be a eukaryotic animal. Not all eukaryotes are animals. Not all animals have spinal columns. The next is going to be our class. Our class is going to be Mammalia. Our order is going to be primates. We're mammals because we have hair, we give birth to live offspring, we produce milk. There are a lot of things that go into classifying us as mammals. We are in the order primates, the family Hominidae, genus Homo, and sapien. These final categories, order, family, genus, species, for at least us as humans, have to do with different facial characteristics, have to do with how we walk, how we hold ourselves, different teeth and dental structures. So anyway, those are going to be our human levels of classification, but all the levels of classification are going to be found over here. The categories are going to be domain, kingdom, phylum, class, order, family, genus, species. Now, I do want you to know this level or these different categories. I need you to know this system. And there are a lot of different mnemonic devices out there to help you remember that order. When I was younger, we didn't include domain in our levels of classification. We started off with kingdom, but the mnemonic I was given was King Philip cried out for goodness sake. And I gotta be honest with you, every time I write a question on an exam about whether, kingdom comes before or after family or before or after genus or species, it's like singing the alphabet. I still have to go, King Philip cried out for goodness sakes. Kingdom, phylum, class, order, family, genus, species. It helps me remember it. I suggest that you find your own mnemonic device, or you can use that one. There are a lot of great ones out there. There are a lot of inappropriate ones out there that I don't feel comfortable sharing, but use whatever you would like. I've also heard King Philip came over for good spaghetti, or for good sandwiches. But I learned King Philip cried out for goodness sake. Kingdom, phylum, class, order, family, genus, species. But we're going to move on from there. Those are just mnemonic devices. Use whatever you need to do to help you remember that order. All right. So next we're going to talk about those domains. Current biochemical evidence suggests that there are 3 domains into which all life can be classified. We have bacteria, archaea, and then eukarya. So this figure shows how they're believed to be related. Both bacteria and archaea may have evolved from a common ancestor very soon after life began. We're going to talk about bacteria and archaea. They're going to sound very similar, but biochemically, they are so completely different that it is believed they were the very, very first split from common ancestors. So both bacteria and archaea may have evolved from the first common ancestor very soon after life began. These 2 domains contain prokaryotes. Prokaryotes mean that they lack a membrane-bound nucleus that the domain eukarya is known for. So there's no nucleus. They're going to be relatively simple in structure. Prokaryotes are structurally very simple, but metabolically complex. And we're going to get into that a little bit later on. However, archaea organize their DNA a little bit differently than bacteria do, and their cell walls and membranes are chemically much more similar to eukaryotes than bacteria, which is why they're believed to have a very early split. So it was concluded that eukarya split off from the archaeal line of descent. So we're going to spend just a little bit of time looking at these 3 different domains, starting with archaea. Domain archaea contains unicellular prokaryotes that live in extreme environments, probably very similar to primitive Earth. So like I said before, prokaryotes lack a membrane-bound nucleus. They're going to come in a variety of shapes. They're going to have adaptations to extreme environments, meaning that they're going to live like in aquatic environments that lack oxygen, or are too salty, or too hot, or too acidic, or have too much pressure for other organisms. And because of this, it's been hypothesized that they are still best suited for the harsh, primitive environments and are potentially the least evolved form of life. They're also going to absorb or chemosynthesize their food, and they have very unique chemical characteristics. I would like you to be able to identify these different domains based on whether they are single-celled or multicellular, and whether they are eukaryotic or prokaryotic cells, and where they are found. For example, on an exam, I may give you a description, and I may say, hey, you know what? Actually, I'm going to give you that example in just a moment. So that was archaea, bacteria. The domain bacteria is going to contain, again, unicellular prokaryotes that live in all environments, including on our skin, in our mouths, in our intestines, in the air, in the water. Bacteria are single-celled prokaryotes, but they are found everywhere. Everywhere. Archaea are single-celled prokaryotes that are found in very extreme environments. Bacteria are just found everywhere. They're prokaryotic cells. They come in a whole variety of shapes that we're going to talk a little bit about later. They are adapted to like all environments: water, soil, skin, mouth, intestines. They absorb, photosynthesize, or chemosynthesize their food, and they again have some unique chemical characteristics. Finally, the last domain is going to be the domain eukarya. The domain eukarya is going to contain unicellular and multicellular eukaryotes, meaning that they contain membrane-bound nucleuses within their cells. So there you go. Just as an example of what you might see on an exam is where I will say, hey, a new organism has been found. It was found at the very, very bottom of the ocean in a giant sulfur vent, and it seems to be a prokaryotic single-celled organism. What domain would you classify this as? You would then need to tell me whether that belongs to eukarya, bacteria, or archaea, and I'm going to let you decide right now what domain that might belong to based on the discussion we've just had. So that's an example of how you may see this tested on in either a pop quiz or in the final exam. So next we're going to spend a little bit of time looking at the domain eukarya and its various kingdoms. Now, archaea and bacteria could eventually someday be broken down into kingdoms, but those kingdom designations are still being determined, and we don't have a lot of information on them in our textbook. However, we do know considerably more about the domain eukarya. Specifically, we're going to break it down into kingdoms, but I'm actually going to pause here because my throat is dry. I need a drink of water. And we're going to come back in a few minutes and we're going to break down those kingdoms a little bit further.